It's not easy to follow up a phenomenal game with another home run. It's even harder to catch lightning in a bottle for a third time in succession. Smackdown vs. Raw 2008 bears an array of negative reviews and a mixed bag of feelings amongst fans. There's plenty to be said about this game, but there's one thing everyone can agree on. The roster came up short. Counting legends and not counting the PSP exclusives. More on those fucking things later. Smackdown vs. Raw 2008 presents a roster of 53, going backwards from the year prior, which had 67 superstars. Grab your shiny first generation iPhones and get ready to go back to 2007 as we attempt to take a look at some key hypothetical additions to the game's roster that maybe would have changed some people's minds about the game, or even elevate an already positive opinion. DLC was just on the horizon, but had not yet landed with WWE games. Once again, it's necessary to provide a disclaimer that the general superstar cutoff for this game was WrestleMania 23. There are superstars on this list that either joined or rejoined the WWE following the cutoff, leaving developers without enough time to add certain justifiable wrestlers whether they wanted to or not. Number 1. Shelton Benjamin. In my opinion, Shelton Benjamin is without a doubt one of the most underutilized talents in WWE history. World-class athleticism, elite grappling prowess, and breathtaking moments all combined to create a premier talent that not only deserved a world title run, but deserved to appear in this game as well. 2007 was the birth of the gold standard. While he received a significant increase in TV time and a refocused singles push on ECW, Benjamin had actually dyed his hair during the reunification stint with Charlie Haas while on Raw. Benjamin had spent the majority of 2007 teaming with Haas, meaning had he been included, it likely would have been under the world's greatest tag team moniker, and I wouldn't have even been mad.
To be real, not counting the ECW factions, this game had what, 3 legitimate tag teams?
Maybe the inclusion of both Benjamin and Haas would have been the right move. These two were able to stay relevant enough to compete in a pay-per-view tag team title match with the Hardy Boys, as well as taking part in a rivalry with Crime Time, both teams that were included in the game. The gold standard landed in ECW a week after the release of Smackdown vs. Raw 2008 and immediately began to shine, reminiscent of his first singles push, this time showing some more independence on the mic as a cocky heel. What is odd is the fact that Shelton Benjamin was included in literally every other edition of Smackdown vs. Raw, but for some reason was left out here, despite being part of the active roster. Just another way that the WWE did Shelton Benjamin dirty, if you ask me. I could go on and on about Shelton Benjamin and what he deserved in the WWE, but one thing cannot be denied. The gold standard deserved to be in Smackdown vs. Raw 2008. Number 2. The Miz. It almost seemed like The Miz wasn't going to ever be featured in a WWE game given the danger his career was in early on. Fortunately for The Miz, he turned things around and is currently living out a Hall of Fame worthy career. The Miz began his in-ring career September of 2006 and received some prominent TV time to introduce the reality TV star to the WWE Universe, going on to compete at Armageddon 2006. The Miz would eventually be sent over to the ECW brand, which was a large talking point as one of the major additions this year's game was presenting. Although he was on SmackDown at the time the development began, The Miz would begin to establish himself in ECW, eventually winning the crowd vote at Cyber Sunday over John Morrison and Big Daddy V to compete for the ECW Championship against CM Punk. Not to mention, The Miz would become one half of the WWE Tag Team Champions 3 days following the release of the game. That is one thing that always frustrated me back in the day was active champions not being in the game. I'm gonna need you to huddle in and once again imagine yourself. You're that preteen that we referred back to in the last video, maybe teenager now, but a year wiser. You're much more organized in the way that you play your WWE games. You just witnessed The Miz and John Morrison become tag team champions after competing as adversaries for months leading up. You're more interested in the banger that is the MVP Matt Hardy feud, but the victory still comes as a shock, and again, you're unable to recreate this big title change. The WWE was clearly making a point to feature The Miz in the mid-card, so it's confusing why another active wrestler was excluded. Granted, this was when the general perception of The Miz leaned towards obnoxious and annoying, rather than, let's say, charming like he's seen today. However, that didn't justify excluding the young superstar, and it certainly held the roster back from being awesome!
We've got to step away from the list for just a moment and just touch on some of the huge names that we as fans just barely missed out on experiencing.
Rob Van Dam likely would have been a lock in this game given the work he had been putting in leading up to the development as well as his spot on the card, even after his arrest. RVD was a mainstay on the roster, but he left the WWE in 2007 due to burnout following the May 28th edition of Raw. Big Show was a focal point of the new ECW, but let his contract expire in February of 2007, just a couple months before the cutoff. While Chris Jericho's cryptic Save Us vignettes began to air in September, Y2J didn't make his return until December, a month following the game's release. Chris Benoit obviously had to be dropped from the game due to the tragedy that occurred in June of 2007. Who do you think belongs on this list? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're a fan of the Smackdown vs. Raw series. Number 3. Santino Marella. Santino Marella shocked the world on April 16, 2007 in what was one of the most popular talking points for a time when Bobby Lashley assisted what seemed to be a fan plucked from the audience to be sacrificed to the Intercontinental Champion. Umanga! Instead, Marella ended up walking away from this encounter as the new Intercontinental Champion and the newest member of the WWE roster. He would prove that while the victory was in fact a major upset, he was a justified champion by holding the title until early July. Throughout the year, Marella would display his natural charisma and a star was born. By the time the game came out, on top of having the title of Intercontinental Champion on his resume, Santino had gotten involved with legends like Jerry Lawler and Stone Cold Steve Austin, or as Santino would say, Stone Cold Steve Austin. And by the end of his WWE tenure, Santino became one of the most beloved stars of recent memory. Now I understand that Santino technically debuted after the Superstar cutoff, but he debuted a mere 15 days following WrestleMania. I mention this because of the fact that Umaga and the Great Khali both made the cut for SmackDown vs. Raw 2007, despite debuting after WrestleMania themselves. SmackDown vs. Raw 2008's roster was in such bad shape, the game really would have benefited to extend that window just a little bit wider to make room for one more unibrow. Number 4. Kevin Thorn. One of the largest selling points of SmackDown vs. Raw 2008 was the inclusion of WWE's third brand at the time, the repackaged ECW. The inclusion of the New Breed and ECW Originals factions as in-game tag teams implies that the development team was fully aware of the New Breed vs. ECW Originals match that took place at WrestleMania 23. You know who was in that match on the team of the New Breed? Kevin Thorn. Kevin Thorn was featured as the enforcer of the faction during the lead-up of the stable's biggest match. The inclusion of Kevin Thorn would naturally suggest the inclusion of Ariel as well, since her entrance is a preset in the game, but she would end up being released in May of 2007.
Whereas Thorn would remain on TV for the majority of the year after an eventual split with the New Breed faction.
But his once seemingly promising push withered away, ultimately leading to a repackaging and his return to developmental territory OVW, never to be seen again in a WWE ring. Maybe his inclusion would have garnered some kind of reaction from the crowd and created a level of connection to extend his career. Regardless, Kevin Thorn was a constant presence in ECW during the time of development, and given guys like Elijah Burke, Marcus Corvan, Sandman, and Sabu all made the cut, Kevin Thorn should have as well. Okay, I said we were going to talk about the PSP exclusives. Eddie Guerrero, Sergeant Slaughter, and Jim the Anvil Neidhart are all exclusively available on the PSP version of this game. Hardcore Holly is also available on the Nintendo DS version. Now, this is a bad idea to begin with. I admit I was an Xbox kid growing up, so I don't know if everybody who had a PlayStation had a PSP as well, but Ukes literally assigned the responsibility of owning 2 physical gaming consoles upon their customers, only for a few extra superstars. Eddie Guerrero should not be an exclusive character. You want to grow your fan base and audience? You do not assign him exclusivity to hardware or gaming consoles. The late, great Latino heat alone would have made an infuriating roster into something that anybody can enjoy. Shame on you, Ukes and THQ, for making these exclusives a thing. Number 5. Beth Phoenix.
SmackDown vs. Raw 2008 has what I believe is the worst roster of active wrestlers in this entire series.
It's fair to say that this game also sported the worst female roster of any game in the series as well.
Featuring 7 women and only 2 as heels, the roster was rather uninspiring beyond Mickie James.
Sure, Kelly was popular, but that just brings up the exclusion of the rest of Extreme Exposé. The addition of Beth Phoenix would have helped alleviate the weak female roster and would have added some credibility, despite her stint as the Glamazon beginning in July. The Glamazon ran roughshod through the women's division of 2007, quickly placing herself at the top of the mountain. Beth Phoenix would win the women's championship at No Mercy in October, and would hold the title until April of 2008, post-WrestleMania 24. This would mean that this was another game void of a current champion at the time of release. Regardless, the addition of the Glamazon, a future Hall of Famer, could have softened the blow that is this disappointing roster. Sure, the roster has got your standard big names like The Undertaker, HBK, Triple H, Randy Orton, and so on. And it even features some highly anticipated guys like Jeff Hardy, CM Punk, and MVP. But the fact is the roster fizzles out quick. I'd love to do an honorable mention spotlight, but quite frankly in this case, the spotlight goes to the quantity of superstars that were in the WWE around this time that could have helped this ailing roster. Jimmy Wang Yang, Deuce and Domino, The Boogeyman, Chuck Palumbo, Cody Rhodes, Dave Taylor, Super Crazy, Eugene, Lance Cade, Trevor Murdoch, and more. And that's not even counting Victoria, Charlie Haas, Paul London, and Brian Kendrick, who are all featured in my video about SmackDown vs. Raw 2007's roster, which you can see here. Thanks for watching everybody, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy.